Uber/taxi drivers of Reddit. What is the most messed up conversation you overheard your passengers having? Story 1. I picked up two drunk guys coming out of a San Antonio Spurs game. They were nice enough, and I even stopped at a Whataburger drive-thru for them. After some casual chit-chat, they settled in and started talking about random stuff. Eventually, the conversation turned to one of their recent bachelor parties, which sounded like it had gone down not too long ago. Typical drunk bro talk soon followed. Stories about the dancers, drinking, and how their buddy had brought way too much powder. Say what now? Things got pretty graphic after that, describing their wild night with the dancers and about their 3 score. Then he casually mentioned that he'd been seeing one of the dancers on the side ever since the bachelor party, but promised that once he got married, he'd totally straighten up. I'm pretty sure they'd completely forgotten. I was even there until we pulled up at their apartment. I got a $20 tip and a chocolate milkshake from Whataburger. Story 2. I was the passenger in this case. My boyfriend and I had just been picked up from the train station. When the lady asked where we'd come from, we told her about our trip, how I'm a huge Stephen King fan, and how my boyfriend planned an awesome, creepy birthday getaway to the Stanley Hotel, room 217. We told her about some of the weird things we'd seen and the eerie moments that happened during our stay. That's when she said, very calmly, that paranormal stuff is real. She knows because she used voodoo once to get rid of her ex-husband. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, she said. He was a bad man. I don't regret it, but 2 weeks after I stabbed his doll in the heart, he passed away of a heart attack. Perfectly healthy guy. I've never touched that stuff again. It was the perfect ending to a creepy trip. Story 3. I was picking up 3 girls and a guy right as the bar was closing. The guy was extremely drunk. One of the girls realized she'd forgotten her phone and a friend ran quickly to grab it. Meanwhile, one girl stayed in my car with the guy. She started telling him to leave his girlfriend, the one who had gone to get the phone, and bragged, I can do it better than her, I'm hotter than her, I can make you happy. I was surprised she was talking trash about her own friend. The other girls returned, and the one who had stayed moved to the front passenger seat. I dropped off one girl who lived nearby and continued driving the other 3 to their destination. That's when I heard unbuckling and saw in the mirror that the guy's girlfriend was giving him a little help. The girl next to me reached back and joined in. I still have no idea how he managed to do it while so drunk. When we reached their destination, the girl in the front seat kissed me on the cheek. After driving off, I checked to make sure the car was clean. Thankfully, there was no mess, though I did have the car detailed the next morning. Story 4. My friend is an Uber driver. One Sunday morning around 4 a.m., he picked up a fare at a casino in Atlantic City and headed to New York City. 2 middle-aged men were in the car. They were clearly trashed, dressed nicely, but a little disheveled, and they had no luggage. During the ride, they told my friend about their long weekend of gambling, clubbing, and other antics. About 2 hours into the 3-hour drive, one of them suddenly interrupted the other's story with a shocked expression. Oh no, we forgot Stephanie! The other guy froze for a moment, then stammered. What? Oh crap, we left her at, oh no, I don't know, where is she? My buddy, the driver, said, oh no, not Stephanie. Should we go back for her? Which would have nearly tripled his fare. The guys weren't keen on going back. One of them called her, and she answered, still at the bar they had left her at. She had lost track of time, assuming the guys were either at the bar or gambling at the casino. Since all 3 had come down to Atlantic City together, the 2 guys asked my friend to go pick her up after dropping them off. He suggested she probably just call another Uber but gave them his number anyway, saying he'd pick her up if she called. They tipped him well. Stephanie never called. Story 5. I once drove a group of bridesmaids to a wedding, and they asked me to stop at a pharmacy on the way. From what I overheard, one of the girls had enjoyed herself a little too much the night before and needed a Plan B pill. Another time, I had a guy in a group who was practically passing out in my back seat. I kept asking if I should take them to the hospital, but they said no, so I just drove them downtown. Turns out their hotel had a complimentary wine hour and they definitely took full advantage. I also had a guy ask if he could kiss me when I was dropping him off. He thought he was entitled because it was his birthday. I declined 3 times before finally telling him to get out of my car. Story 6. I have 3 that stick out. 1. I gave a ride to a large Jamaican man who had earbuds in and was on his phone, gesturing wildly while referring to himself in the third person. He was a rapper and spent the entire ride bragging about how incredible he was, claiming he had turned down a $400,000 recording contract because it wasn't enough, and that in 3 years he would be dating Rihanna. I looked him up later and found a few articles from 2 or 3 years earlier calling him a promising rapper, but nothing recent and certainly nothing suggesting he was on the verge of stardom. 2. I had a guy taking calls from a Craigslist ad he had posted. He said his aunt worked for an insurance agency, and if someone signed their name on a life insurance policy, they would get a check and then split it with him once it was cashed. After 2 or 3 declines, he asked if I was interested. I told him I did not want to commit whatever kind of fraud he was planning. I considered reporting him, but his plan seemed so stupid that he probably got caught anyway. 3. I picked up a high schooler. After a couple of minutes, he started talking about how he had been arrested, completely unprovoked. He was quick to point out it wasn't anything violent, just white-collar crimes. What? He went on to explain he got busted for tax evasion from selling guns or something. The whole time, I felt like this was a very strange thing to unload on your Uber driver. Then, on the way, we had to stop by a bank so he could deposit a check or something. He said it would only take 30 seconds. After significantly more than 30 seconds had passed, I started to get concerned. His mom had requested the ride, and I didn't even know his name. Was I the getaway driver or something? After a couple of minutes of looking around and listening for police sirens, he came out normally. There was traffic for the rest of the ride. I wanted nothing more than to drop this kid off and get out of there. He kept insisting that he wasn't a bad person and hadn't hurt anyone. Eventually, I dropped him off and had to take a minute to compose myself. I feel like there's a good chance he was messing with me. Later, while hanging out with his friends, he said I totally convinced my Uber driver that I was some kind of psychopathic criminal. It was a very unsettling experience. Story 7. I used to drive a van service for my university, which was mostly boring, though weekends could get interesting when people were getting drunk. One quiet afternoon shift, I was cruising down a side street when a huge guy stepped out and signaled me. He was with 4 friends, all equally enormous, asking if I could take them across campus. Even though I had only talked to him for a few seconds, it was clear he was high out of his mind, and his friends were even further gone. Oh, and did I mention they were in costume as the village people? Because they were. Naturally, I figured this was too good to pass up, so I let my dispatcher know I was taking an unplanned pickup. Meanwhile, these 4 massive guys, seriously, all at least 6 feet tall, started folding themselves into the tiny van seats. As we pulled out, one of them started freaking out, telling his buddies he had drunk too much and thought he was going to die. He didn't look that bad, but I was in no mood to clean puke off the floor. Fortunately, his relatively sober friend reassured him that all was fine and reminded him he had been drinking O'Doul's, non-alcoholic beer, for those who don't know. By now, I was relieved, but the high Uber dude behind me was still struggling to process that he wasn't about to meet his maker. He knew he had drank a lot, and it tasted like beer, so the idea that he might not actually be drunk wasn't sticking. He and his buddy had this fantastic back and forth, starting with an explanation of how you can make beer without alcohol and ending with some borderline heartfelt declarations of bro love. I was struggling not to lose it during the whole exchange, but things started to calm down as I pulled over to drop them off. As they were getting out of the car, one of the other guys up until that point passed out in the back seat chimed in, "Wait, why the heck did we buy a rack of O'Doul's?" Story 8. I drove for Uber for about a week. One day a lady got into my car, and I could tell something was wrong. I asked how she was and started the trip. Soon after, her phone rang and she began freaking out about her broke-a boyfriend. Then she got fired up, saying he hadn't come home last night with her new car. I learned he was meeting his probation officer that morning and couldn't miss it. That's when I realized I was driving her to go look for her car because her crappy boyfriend had stolen it. As we arrived at the municipal building, she told me I could pull over anywhere. My city is medium-sized, but parking is all over the place. This poor woman was already late for work because of her deadbeat boyfriend, and I couldn't just let her wander around looking for her car. I offered her 10 minutes of my time to drive around and help search. While we were driving, she told me all about this jerk, trying to call him and leaving voicemails. Finally, he called back. They ended up yelling at each other. He claimed he was getting her tire fixed because of a rock. Afterwards, I fed her Miss Independent alter ego, telling her she deserved better and that he would never change. About 8 minutes later, we found her car. We started hooting and hollering. I pulled up in front of it and waited to make sure it was hers. She unlocked the car, opened the front door, and quickly slammed it. Then I saw her run to the back seat, open the door, and start hitting someone. In my head, I thought, "Oh dude, you deserve this crap." As I watched in awe, she dragged another woman out of the car by her hair. It was insane. I still get a weird adrenaline rush thinking about it. I'll never forget the look Miss Independent gave me when I asked how she was. She nodded, got into her car, and drove off. Story 9. I wasn't the driver or the passenger in this one, but my friends and I witnessed the whole thing. It's not a conversation per se, but it's still the most entertaining thing I've seen involving taxis or Ubers. I grew up and still live in a well-known college party town. One night, my buddies and I were hanging out at a friend's house, drinking a little, and decided to head out for late-night burritos. By the time we got there, it was close to 2 a.m., when the bars were about to close. Some of us got food, some didn't, and we all perched on the ledge of the big window in front of the restaurant. The place sat on the corner of a busy intersection in a student-heavy neighborhood. Across the street was a popular student bar, and we noticed a woman in her 60s, wearing a very short skirt, floating around the entrance. As people started trickling out when the bar closed, it became clear she was trying to snag a young guy who was far too drunk to know better. This went on for a few minutes until the last group of guys filtered out, and they had a straggler. She snagged him. The guy could barely stand. A cab pulled up, and she opened the door to let him climb in first. Before she could get in, though, the driver sped off and made a fast U-turn in the intersection. The cab's windows were down, so we could hear the passengers screaming as they circled past. "What are you doing?" The driver shouted back. "I'm doing you a favor." Meanwhile, the woman chased after the cab, waving her hand in the air as if the driver had accidentally forgotten her. We just sat there, stunned that the driver had done the guy such a solid. Story 10. Not exactly a conversation, and I wasn't involved. Two friends of mine were at a party where they met two girls. One had just gotten into a fight with her boyfriend, and the other was her friend. My friends, being nice guys and a bit bored, accompanied the girls and took a taxi on their way home. During the ride, one guy started making out with one of the girls, and things got intense. The other girl crying beside them made the guy in the front seat uncomfortable. She was drunk and sad and began touching his hair, face, and neck. Despite being a bit scared, her ex-boyfriend was huge and strong. He went along. He pulled his seat back, rested his head on the crying girl's lap, and they started making out. The destination was about an hour away, so they had plenty of time. By now, the taxi driver seemed either extremely uncomfortable or oddly excited. The makeout session in the back seat was intensifying. This continued until they dropped off the other girl and guy. The crying girl and the guy stayed in the back seat, making out until they reached her house. The guy followed her inside. You can guess what happened next. Story 11. Not mine, but my little brother's. He picked up a couple, both in their early 40s, from a bar. Being super outgoing, he chatted with them the whole way. Somehow the topic came up that he had never done shrooms. The guy immediately said they should swing by his place first. When they got there, the door was locked, and he didn't have his keys. They were trying to figure out a way in, and there happened to be a dog flap. My friend got on his hands and knees, crawled through, and unlocked the door from the inside. The guy went in, grabbed some stuff, and then they headed to the woman's house. When he dropped them off, they invited him inside. Some background. This happened in Utah, and my brother was just getting over his first marriage, which hadn't even lasted a year. They got to talking about it, and the woman asked if he'd never seen a real woman before, then flashed him. They all just continued talking for a while after that. When it was time for him to leave, they tipped him $100 and a bag of shrooms. Later, he showed me videos of himself doing the shrooms with a friend sitting with him. Not exactly an overheard conversation, but definitely a bizarre sequence of events. Story 12. The ride started with me driving her to a sketchy part of a rundown city to drop off money to her friend. She was on the phone, probably with her boyfriend, talking about the approach and logistics of the money drop. As she got out and walked to her friend, she didn't realize I could see the entire transaction in my side door mirror. I still don't understand why some dealers think dropping things on the ground makes them less incriminating. Clearly, some of them are really bad at this. She climbed back in for the second leg, and an awkward silence hung over the car for a good 5 minutes until I broke it with, "You know, I really don't care what you do. I just want 5 stars, said as politely and unthreateningly as possible. She started giggling, so I followed up with a gentle warning, "Be careful. You could be reported that we were trained to leave people and call the police if things felt off." Honestly, I couldn't have cared less. 5 stars and a tip make most problems disappear. She said she usually gets a ride there and calls another if she feels uneasy. I'm glad she didn't this time. That neighborhood was sketchy, and I wouldn't have wanted anything bad to happen to her. Story 13. The first time I ever used Uber, I was in St. Louis on vacation with my wife. We'd never been there and weren't familiar with the city. We were heading downtown with this driver who I think was from the Middle East. When we spotted the Archie, excited we started talking about it. The driver began rattling off facts. The arch was constructed in France and delivered here as a token of friendship in 1844. I shot my wife a questioning look. He continued, "A lot of people don't know that, which is why it faces exactly east, toward the Statue of Liberty." At that point, we knew he was full of it, but we let him continue because it was entertaining. When it first came over, the elevator inside it was hand-driven by 15 men at a time using a pulley system. We still have no idea whether he was messing with us or genuinely believed what someone once told him, but it made for a pretty memorable ride. Story 14. I've had a couple of breakups happen in my car, but this one was something else. It was this past New Year's Eve. When I arrived at the pickup location, the girl asked me to wait a minute because there was some drama. Apparently, her boyfriend wanted to drive home, but he had been drinking. She told a party full of frat bros, and suddenly she had an army of them ready to confront him. After a lot of yelling, aggressive gestures, and flexing, the couple finally got into my car and started arguing. He said, "Sir, please let me out about a block down the road." She shouted, "Sir, if you let him out, he might drive home drunk." I said, "I can't detain him. If he gets in his car, call the police." He shot back, "Forget it. I'm walking home." I tried to smooth things over. "Hey man, it'd be super easy for me to take you home. Then you can sleep in your own bed." He looked tempted, but ultimately declined and walked off. She cried the entire way to her place. It was very awkward. Story 15. I picked up an S-worker downtown Minneapolis at 3 a.m. She got in the car and immediately started on her phone. I started the trip and saw she was headed to Mankato, about an hour and a half southeast of the city for those unfamiliar with Minnesota. The ride began fairly normally since she wasn't paying attention to me. About 20 minutes in, she suddenly started raising her voice at whoever was on the other end. From what I could gather, it was her boss, furious that she hadn't bailed out another girl who got caught in an S-work sting the night before. Really, he just wanted to have her brought back in the same Uber ride to Mankato. He didn't want to pay for 2 trips. Her response nearly made me lose it laughing. That S-worker didn't pay me back the bail money from last time. She said not taking payment for freaking my nephew was good enough. Story 16. Back when I was driving, I arrived at a pickup, and the passenger came out saying he didn't have money on his debit card but had cash. He wasn't going far and handed me $20, so I figured, why not? Canceled the ride and turned the app off. While we were driving, he started talking about a couple of new handguns he'd just picked up and how great they were. That turned into a conversation about how he was a dealer and needed protection. Apparently, he took a liking to me and asked if I wanted to start running things for him on the side. He even demanded my phone number so he could get in touch. Fortunately, we were close to his destination, so as he got out of the car, I gave him a fake number and got out of there. Didn't drive for Lyft/Uber much longer after that. Story 17. Not a taxi story, but back in college, I had to take the bus a couple of miles to campus. One early morning, a pretty disheveled-looking guy got on about 2 miles from campus. He had no backpack, and a couple of stops later, another guy recognized him and started talking. The first guy explained how he'd partied at a frat house the night before and woke up in a puddle of his own pee on the couch. At that point, I noticed a faint pee smell on the bus. He apparently panicked, bolted out of the house, and started walking in the direction he thought led home. Somehow, he made it to the outskirts of town where the bus picked him up before realizing he was going completely the wrong way. He rode the rest of the way to campus and then had to endure what I assume was a pee-covered walk of shame in the correct direction. Story 18. The first time I was in Chicago with colleagues, we passed this massive, epic-looking McDonald's on the way to our hotel and remarked that we'd never seen one like it. Our taxi driver said, "That's right, this is the first ever McDonald's." We were all like, "Wow, really? Cool. We'll have to check it out." Later, after going out for drinks, we embarked on a drunken mission, probably passing 2 or 3 other McDonald's along the way, until we finally reached the so-called first ever McDonald's. We didn't expect the food to be any different, but hey, we could say we ate at the original McDonald's. That's what we call it, where I live. The next day at our Chicago office, our colleagues laughed at us. Apparently, it's not the first ever McDonald's at all, and for some reason, that taxi driver had completely made it up. Story 19. Not a driver story, but from a passenger perspective. My girlfriend and I were getting dropped off at Disney World, making the usual small talk. The driver mentioned he was from Cuba, and I mentioned I'm part Cuban. That's when it all took off. He proceeded to tell me about his religion. I'm still not entirely sure what it was, though my family is Catholic and I think it was somewhere in that ballpark. He said he was a sorcerer, showed off all his dragon rings, and talked about the mystical powers of some saint. He also claimed his ex-wife was a voodoo practitioner who did all kinds of strange things, which led to their divorce. At one point, he played some chant-sounding audio from his phone, but I don't speak Spanish, so I had no idea what it was. Finally, he wished us a good time at Disney, and we were on our way. Story 20. I was just having small talk with my Uber driver when he started making really uncomfortable comments about black people, and he was black himself. I didn't really know how to respond, so I just let him talk. He went on about how he hated that other black guys make the rest look bad, and how he had escaped poverty by working hard. I guess he had an "I did it, so why can't they" mentality, but it was awkward to listen to. Then he asked if I wanted to play some music. I asked what he liked, just to be polite. He launched into a rant about how rap is trash and how he loves classic rock and metal. I wasn't sure if he was messing with me, but he seemed genuine. I never got him again after that, and I still wonder what he's up to. Story 21. A friend who drove Uber for a few months told me about one night. He picked up two drunk dudes from a bar. A pretty standard night for him. The guys started talking about random stuff, mostly ignoring my friend. Then the topic turned to their girlfriends. At that point, my friend tuned them out to focus on the road. Suddenly, he hears noise, looks over, and the two drunk dudes are making out. My friend freaked out and told them to stop and calm down. The two broke apart, breathing heavily. One said, "Man, smash Beth." The other replied, "No, smash me." After that, they went back to talking about random stuff for the rest of the ride. My friend said it felt like being a background character in a romance novel. Awkward as hell. Story 22. I'm not an Uber driver, but my friends and I have a tradition when we're heading to a bar and riding in the back of an Uber. We all pile in, one by one, and my friend launches into this hilarious, over-the-top story about his adventures with the girl from last night. He goes into insane detail, how things escalate, and eventually she does something completely absurd and gross. The best part is watching the driver's reactions. Most of the time, they start cracking up in disbelief. We've even developed a bit of a reputation with a few drivers in our city. We'll get in, and they'll shout, "Hey, you're the crap guys." It's pretty hysterical. Story 23. I was an Uber passenger with a friend when our driver picked us up. Partway through the ride, he apologized. "Guys, I'm on a conference call and have a headset in." We said, "No problem," and kept to ourselves, though he would occasionally chime in. Toward the end of the ride, he said, "Sorry, I have to chime in on the meeting. I expected some boring business stuff like fourth quarter projections are down or something." Instead, he said, "All right, everyone, we need to calm down. This isn't the first time someone has offed themselves in our organization. It's a shame what happened to Frank, but we need to get out in front of this and put our PR team on it." I just looked at my friend like, "What the heck?" Then he dropped us off. Story 24. I once picked up a middle-aged woman who was headed to a spiritual church. For those who don't know, that's a religion where they believe in spirits, reincarnation, and all that sort of thing. She was alone, and at one point I heard her talking. I thought she was speaking to me, so I asked, "Sorry, could you repeat that?" She said, "Oh, sorry, I have an orange in my mouth." I'd never heard that expression before. It's not common in my country, so I was just confused and went back to driving. A few minutes later, I heard her talking again, clearly having a full-on conversation, asking and answering questions. I glanced back, no phone, no earbuds, nothing. When I dropped her off, I couldn't help myself and asked, "How many people are in this car?" She just gave me a look that made me wish I hadn't asked. Story 25. As a Lyft driver, I haven't encountered many truly weird conversations, but I once overheard this guy on the phone for what felt like forever. I couldn't tell if he was talking to a doctor or an interviewer. Things took a darker turn when he started discussing which medications he was on. Most of them sounded like something a person dealing with depression might take. Sure enough, over the phone, he explained that he was struggling with depression and insomnia. He looked like any normal college kid. He went on to share other personal details I won't repeat. What surprised me was that this was his third ride with me. I dropped him off at his university and workplace the other 2 times, and I had thought he was just another normal college kid. Story 26. A buddy of mine drove Uber for a couple of years. One Saturday night, a good-looking woman in a slim black dress hopped in. She seemed normal at first, but after some small talk, she not so subtly hinted she was an S-worker. She liked his music, thought he was funny, and eventually offered him $100 cash per ride to be her exclusive pickup and drop-off driver when she saw clients. It was tempting, but clearly illegal, so he almost said yes, then decided to turn it down. Later, he read that Denver PD had been watching drivers who made deals with S-workers and drug dealers. Much easier to avoid suspicion when you're just the passenger. Story 27. An Uber driver picked up my buddy and me to take us to the bars. He was one of those quiet drivers who kept to himself, headphones in, music playing. We started talking about fake football fans, and I said, "Yeah, my ex was a huge Pats fan, so I used to play this game with her, get her to name 5 players. She could barely get through Brady and Edelman before stammering. Oddly enough, she always remembered Rob Nikovich for some reason." The driver just started cracking up laughing. No words were exchanged after that, but I like to think that ranks among the stranger things he's heard while driving. But the story didn't end there. My buddy and I kept going. Once we got started on fake sports fans, we couldn't stop. He started talking about a girl he dated who claimed to be a diehard basketball fan. She had all the Lakers gear and knew the big names like Kobe and Shaq, but the second he asked about role players or the team's recent record, she'd change the subject. She could name the mascots, but not the point guard, he said, and we both laughed pretty hard. I noticed the Uber driver subtly adjusting his headphones. He wasn't being nosy, but he was definitely listening, so we leaned into it. I mentioned my cousin who claimed to be a big-time soccer fan but could only name Beckham and Ronaldo. My buddy said, "That's like calling yourself a chef, because you know who Gordon Ramsay is." The driver actually let out a snort at that one. For someone trying to keep to himself, that was my cue. We had officially crossed into weird conversation overheard territory. The best part came when my friend decided to impersonate his ex, pretending to know football. He put on a high-pitched voice and said, "Oh my gosh, Tom Brady is the quarterback, right? And Gronk is like the kicker?" At that exact moment, the car hit a red light. The driver finally pulled out one earbud, leaned slightly, and said, "Gronk is the kicker? Man, that's criminal." We all burst out laughing, and just like that, the ice was completely broken. From there, the conversation took on this weird confessional vibe. My buddy admitted he once pretended to know hockey just to impress a girl. I confessed that I'd lied about knowing golf terms because my boss at the time was obsessed with the sport. Finally, the Uber driver chimed in with his own story. He once had a passenger brag about being a die-hard Raiders fan, only to accidentally call them the Raiders from San Francisco. He said that ride was the hardest he'd ever tried not to laugh. By the time we got to the bars, it didn't feel like a quiet Uber ride anymore. What started as joking about fake sports fans had turned into a full-blown confessional about how people everywhere fake being into sports. The best part? Our driver, who had initially wanted nothing to do with conversation, ended up laughing the hardest. Looking back, I'm convinced it was one of the weirdest conversations he'd ever overheard on the job, and honestly, one of the funniest rides I've ever had. Story 28. When I was 15, I had to split a cab with a stranger who was clearly older and hitting on me. It's a long story, but I swear this was my only way home at the time. With our money pooled, we could still only make it to about a 30-minute walk from my house, which I figured was fine. Except during the ride, this guy went from being moderately creepy to downright scary. He kept making comments that made my stomach drop, talking about things he noticed about me, asking personal questions I didn't want to answer, and suggesting I should come home with him instead of continuing to my own house. At first, I tried to laugh it off and ignore him, but the tone in his voice gradually became more insistent, and the casual flirting turned into a sense of threat. I remember staring out the window, trying to calculate how far we were from my house, and feeling completely trapped. I tried thinking of excuses, anything to get him to back off, but nothing worked. Every time I shifted in my seat or tried to deflect, he would lean a little closer or comment on how helpful it would be if I just went with him. My heart was racing, I could barely breathe without feeling tense, and I had to remind myself to stay calm so he didn't notice how scared I was. When the cab finally stopped at a red light, I knew I couldn't walk the rest of the way safely with him, following me or trying to convince me. So, summoning as much courage as I could, I turned to the driver and asked quietly if there was any way he could just take me home instead. My voice was shaky, but I tried to sound normal. I even told him my parents could pay when we got there. The driver looked at me, and in that brief moment, I saw complete understanding in his eyes. He didn't ask a single question, he just nodded and subtly locked the doors. Then, calmly but firmly, he turned to the creepy guy and told him this was his stop. The man protested, clearly frustrated, but the driver didn't budge. He repeated in no uncertain terms that the ride was over for him and he needed to get out. The stranger muttered under his breath and finally left the cab, glaring at me as he walked away, and the driver waited until he was gone before starting the car again. Once the man left, the driver drove me all the way to my house without saying much, but with a sense of quiet professionalism. He didn't charge me a cent. I had never been so scared and then so thankful in my life. Story 29. I have a friend who was taking the train from St. Louis back up to Chicago after his bachelor party. They had been drinking that morning, and he wanted to get off for a smoke break at the next stop. The train dude told him that there isn't time to get off for a smoke. My drunk friend throws a fit and calls him a wuss and other names. They make him get off the train in Springfield. He took an Uber from Springfield back to Chicago, which is a little over 3 hours. His total was around $170. I was shocked by how cheap I thought that was. I just looked up the price from Chicago to Springfield right now, and it quoted me $523. But that's not even the weirdest part. Apparently, when he got into the Uber, the driver gave him a look like he knew exactly what kind of passenger he was about to deal with. My friend, still a little tipsy and ranting about how unfair the train system was, immediately started talking non-stop. He detailed every ridiculous thing that had happened at the bachelor party, the fights he had watched, how his buddy had tried to flirt with a clearly uninterested waitress, and somehow got into a story about how he lost a flip-flop in a fountain downtown. The Uber driver, surprisingly calm, just nodded along and occasionally laughed. I guess after years of hearing all sorts of passenger stories, it barely fazed him. My friend then started philosophizing about why people get so mad over small rules, how trains were supposed to be efficient but weren't, and whether public transportation was even morally sound. The driver chuckled and replied, Well, I guess that depends on whether you're sober or not, which sent my friend into a half-hearted debate about whether alcohol enhanced or destroyed logic. About an hour into the ride, my friend's drunken energy shifted into something else. He started asking the driver personal questions, where he was from, if he had ever taken long trips alone, and whether he had any wild Uber stories. The driver shared a few tales, like the time he had a passenger who tried to teach him how to juggle while driving safely, he claimed, or the guy who had a pet parrot that refused to sit still. My friend, fascinated, started laughing so hard he nearly cried, telling the driver he wished he had someone like him to talk to on every long trip. Midway through Illinois, the conversation took another turn. My friend began speculating about life in general, why people do the things they do, and how some people are just doomed to create chaos wherever they go. The driver stayed quiet this time, just nodding and occasionally throwing in a, "Huh, never thought about it that way," or "interesting point." My friend even tried to convince the driver to take a detour so he could show him the spot where he had thrown his flip-flop into the fountain. The driver declined, politely, and my friend shrugged, satisfied he at least had someone to hear his ridiculous story. By the time they got close to Chicago, my friend had exhausted most of his bachelor party anecdotes and switched topics to what he wanted for dinner, how he couldn't believe how expensive Uber rides are sometimes, and how he might consider just walking home next time if he wasn't 3 hours away. The driver gave him a look that said, "Buddy, you've got stories for days." They talked quietly for the last 20 minutes, mostly laughing about minor mishaps along the way, until finally they pulled up near his apartment. The driver helped him out of the car, and my friend, still a little buzzed, thanked him profusely for being patient and listening to his drunken ramblings for over 3 hours. He even left a generous tip because, as he said later, not everyone would put up with a guy like me. The Uber driver just smiled and nodded, probably thinking he had heard it all before, but secretly knowing that long rides like these were sometimes the best part of his day. Story 30. I wasn't the driver but the passenger. I got in the taxi I ordered from the train station to my house, and there was a small carnival we drove past. The evening air had a crisp chill, and the streets were unusually quiet for a Friday night. The carnival tents, brightly colored with strings of lights blinking intermittently, looked festive against the darkening sky. Yet there was something off about it, though I didn't notice immediately. The taxi driver and I had been chatting, the usual small talk you get when a driver is working and trying to make the ride more pleasant. He asked me where I had come from, and I explained my trip from a business meeting across town. I mentioned the little coffee shop I had stopped at for a quick bite, and he nodded approvingly. He told me he liked those little hidden spots where tourists rarely venture. The conversation was light, talking about traffic, local news, and the weather, as we made our way down Main Street. Then, as we passed this carnival, the driver's tone shifted just slightly, though not dramatically. He seemed almost hesitant, like he wanted to see if I was paying attention. He started talking about how the carnival was shutting down, and the reason he gave made my stomach tighten. According to him, 2 7-year-olds had been kidnapped there just the day before. He said the police were completely stumped, with no leads, and he shook his head as if to emphasize how horrifying the situation was. He said that even mentioning it made him feel uneasy, that he couldn't stop thinking about the poor girls and how their families must be suffering. At first, I wasn't sure if he was joking or exaggerating to make conversation, but the way he described the scene, the worried parents, the security guards scouring the carnival grounds, the frantic whispers among the performers, made it sound like a real event. He talked about how carnival staff had been panicking, that rides were being shut down early, and even mentioned that local news crews were supposedly on their way to cover the story. The details were oddly specific. The particular tent the girls had last been seen near, the cotton candy stand that was supposed to be their favorite, the Ferris wheel that had stopped midway while authorities tried to investigate. I remember glancing at the carnival tents as we drove past, half expecting to see police tape or a crowd of journalists. But there was nothing, just the regular lights, a few stragglers walking around, and the faint smell of popcorn and funnel cakes drifting through the air. I tried to mask my disbelief with a casual, "Wow, that's awful." But the driver continued, his voice now almost whispering, as if sharing a secret that shouldn't be known. He went on about how he had always liked driving past carnivals because they reminded him of his childhood, but after hearing about the kidnappings, he said he didn't think he could ever enjoy them the same way again. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked a few follow-up questions. Were the kids found? I asked hesitantly. The driver shook his head and said that the police hadn't found them yet, and that it could be days before anyone knew anything. He said the carnival was supposedly under investigation, with security cameras being reviewed and interviews being conducted with every single person working that night. The intensity in his voice made it hard not to believe him, and I felt an uneasy knot in my stomach. By this point, I had started to notice the driver's eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, as if checking to make sure no one else in the taxi could overhear him. He muttered something about how he didn't usually share stories like this with passengers, but sometimes it helped him process things. I nodded quietly, unsure of what to say, as my mind raced. Was this real? Why hadn't I seen anything in the news? Surely something like that would be all over social media or local news broadcasts. As the ride continued, he began recounting more of the details. How carnival rides were closed one by one, how the performers had been questioned repeatedly, and how some of the other attendees had reportedly seen a suspicious van leaving the area. He described the chaos as if he had been there in person, the urgency in his storytelling making it sound even more believable. At one point, he mentioned the police using K9 units to comb the surrounding streets, adding another layer of authenticity to the story. I sat quietly, nodding along, feeling increasingly tense and unsure whether to ask more questions or just remain silent. Finally, as we turned a corner near my street, he seemed to realize he had been going on for quite a while. He paused, took a deep breath, and apologized, saying he sometimes got carried away when telling stories about what he overheard or saw during his taxi shifts. He laughed nervously, saying he didn't mean to scare passengers, but that it was hard not to get wrapped up in all the weird stuff he had encountered over the years. Once I got home and stepped out of the taxi, I thanked him quietly and shut the door. My hands were still slightly shaky from the tension of the story. I had to know whether this bizarre tale was true or if I had just been part of another one of those weird conversations you sometimes overhear from Uber or taxi drivers. I went online, checking local news archives, social media posts, and even forums where local parents discussed events in town. To my surprise and relief, none of it was true. None of the supposed kidnappings had ever happened, and there was no record of any such event occurring in the town's history. The carnival was operating as normal, with no reports of closures or police investigations. Story 31. I picked up a very drunk sorority girl one Friday night after a party. She was barely coherent, but insisted she needed to get her ID from her dorm before heading out to meet her friends again. No problem, I thought, so we made a quick stop at her dorm. She fumbled with her keys and backpack, muttering to herself about how she always loses everything, and apologized to me about a dozen times for slowing things down. Once she finally came back to the car, she looked around, squinting like she was trying to see someone hiding in the shadows, and asked, "Where's Stephanie?" I blinked and said, who? Stephanie, where did she go? She was supposed to come with me. I reassured her, there's only been me and you in this car the entire trip. For a moment she seemed to hesitate, like she was trying to process that. But the drunken gears in her brain clearly weren't turning very fast. She gave me a skeptical look, muttered something about she would have remembered, and fidgeted in her seat. Then she leaned forward and asked a series of increasingly strange questions, like whether I had picked up anyone else before her, if I knew her friends, and if she could trust that I wasn't hiding someone in the trunk. I tried to keep the conversation light, joking that the only extra passengers I carry are imaginary, but she just stared at me like I was lying. Finally, she made an excuse to get dropped off much sooner than she originally planned. I didn't argue because I thought it was better to let her go somewhere she felt safe. On the way, she kept giving me sideways glances, whispering, "I just don't understand," and I could tell she was replaying the whole Stephanie thing in her head. When I dropped her off at a group of friends waiting outside, she waved weakly, still muttering about Stephanie. I shook my head, drove off, and couldn't help but laugh quietly. Drunk or not, that was one of the weirdest conversations I've overheard in my car. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.